30, I think we should begin this leadership team meeting. Could we please start with 72 seconds silence to remember all of those who died in the Grenfell tragedy? Thank you. Are there any apologies for absence? I don't believe so. Are there any declarations of interest? No. And before we go into the main body of the meeting, can I just remind you, because of the COVID regulations, if you could please wear your mask if you're not speaking, and if you could please remain seated while you are speaking. Thank you. The minutes of the leadership team meeting held on the 9th of June, can I sign these as a true and correct record? Agreed. Thank you. Just sign. Great. Please could we turn to paper A4, the Grenfell Housing Legacy Fund. Kim, do you want to introduce this briefly?
Yes, thank you. So, obviously, as a council, we committed to establish a legacy for Grenfell, and this is a £1 million fund over 3 years. And it's not defined, and I think that's quite important. So it can be anything, and it's ultimately for the residents on the estates, and it will be dealt with effectively on an estate-by-state basis to make that decision. We've had a lot of consultation on it. And we've got a number, but although nothing is defined, set out in the paper, it talks about some of the areas that where are particular popular. But really, just to say, as I say, this is very much for the estates and for the estates' decision. So really, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Anne.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Kim. So I'm really happy to see another scheme where local people are making decisions on what happens to their local area, and particularly where they live. I guess I had a couple of comments and a question. I mean, £1 million is a lot of money, and you know, you've said that it's not really defined how that money is going to be spent. I guess I just, having had a very similar experience with the Grenfell Project Fund, I guess I just wanted to hear some thoughts on how we make sure we get value for that money, how we make sure it doesn't get so diluted that it isn't meaningful, and I guess just any kind of principles or thoughts on how the money is going to be allocated.
Dan, can I ask you to answer those?
Yeah, of course. So to take the last part of the question first, as the report said, the first part of how it's allocated is that it's done kind of prorated by property. So each estate gets an amount of money to spend that's calculated on the basis of the number of homes on that estate. Then within that, as Councillor Taylor-Smith has said, the starting principle is that it's then for the residents on that estate to come up with proposals and then vote on those proposals to decide how to prioritise the use of that money. But then to fold in the first part of your question, yes, you're clearly right. This is public money, and this is what this can't be is simply a process of the council kind of making the money available and then walking away from the process. And there's a number of reasons for that, partly for the reasons that you say about how we should be able to, I mean, I think probably the best word is advise the residents on the estates about how they might get the best use for the money with the highest impact. For example, weighing up the pros and cons of lots of little amounts of money on several projects versus the use of all of the money on one or two bigger things. We're also giving estates the option of pooling their resources, so estates could pool their resources together to get even bigger, smaller number of kind of even bigger projects. But the other thing that we could perhaps advise on is ensuring that the money is not used in a way that would kind of overlap with things that are already happening, or kind of even conflict with things that are already happening, either being done by the council or elsewhere. And then crucially, the final thing I think we might be able to offer advice on is where helping residents identify where match funding might be available for other sources. So actually the resources that's available from the fund could be enhanced by making bids to elsewhere. So I think in all of those ways, council officers can kind of add value to the process, if you like, while still staying true to the really important principle that the final decisions lie with the residents, if you see what I mean. I mean, so we see it as a collaborative process, but with real clarity about where the final decision making lies.
Thank you, because I think other people had sort of various concerns that it will be diluted, etc., but I think you've allayed them. So that's great. Are there any other questions on this paper? Sorry, Catherine.
Hello, thank you for that. And again, I welcome this. I just wanted to ask specifically about one of the most popular options or ideas that they had, themes, was to increase economic opportunities for residents, which obviously is quite a sort of complex thing to do with, as we've just been discussing, potentially small grants distributed among several estates. So I was wondering what you were envisaging that might look like, and maybe give us some specific examples of how they might use the money to do that.
Specifically on economic opportunities? Yeah. So I think I mean, I want to be really cautious here because, of course, the whole point is that the proposals aren't supposed to be coming from the council, but just to try and illustrate the kind of thing. One of the things that's been talked about is something that could focus on improving the skills that residents have. So people have talked about the idea of a skills library, for example, where residents can work with each other to kind of mentor each other or support each other, where, for example, a resident could teach a neighbour a skill in that could lead to them to be able to earn money in return for their neighbour teaching them a language, for example. So things that are kind of where they're kind of exchanging and supporting each other and just creating a place and a set of resources that would enable that to happen. And to sit alongside that, or kind of separately from that, the fund could support the provision of places, so unused spaces perhaps that the council has, or that we could support residents to find unused spaces that are owned by other third parties, which you could turn into a kind of affordable rented workspace, for example. And that the fund could be used either to subsidise rents or make improvements to the property and that kind of thing. And I think what's really important, and this is perhaps especially significant given the other work going on in the council and elsewhere on economic recovery in the context of the pandemic, is that, and this relates a bit to my answer to Councillor Siren's question, we've got to recognise that these projects will not be happening in a vacuum. It would be a shame to use this money in a way that duplicated or kind of interfered with other initiatives. And I think, as I say, part of the value that we can add from the council side is to make sure that that the residents who are working up these proposals understand what else is going on and understand what other sources of support are, understand how these projects could integrate with that wider package of work, so that we are getting the maximum amount of help that is actually going to be meaningful help to residents for the public resources that are available. And I think it's also, and it's just probably a statement of fact that there's some expert knowledge in the council that could help advise residents on how to get the best value, and we offer that advice in good faith, but again, as I said to Councillor Siren, in very clear recognition of where the final decisions lie.
Thank you. That's really clear. Are there any other questions on this paper from the leadership team? Okay, before I come to the recommendations, is there anything from your committee, Marie-Thérèse? The OC?
You could outline, is it a one-off, this grant, or is it, does it go over several years? I just wondered.
Dan?
Well, so I think we're expecting that it probably would be spent over the course. I mean, it's one-off in the sense that it's 1 million and it won't be renewed after that because it's from the Grenfell Recovery Fund. I think we're slightly we're open-minded about precisely how long it will take the process to decide. It slightly depends on what the projects are over the time over which it will be spent. But I think we expect the participatory process, the decision-making process, will probably run over the course of the next year, and that then, depending on what the projects are, it would be invested following that. I think the other thing that's worth saying in terms of timing is that we're really keen that although there's a wide range of possible projects that this could be spent on, from kind of physical interventions to other things, the word legacy is taken very seriously, and this needs to be something which can have a kind of visible, lasting impact, either in terms of a physical place or the human capital impacts and so on. So that although it is a one-off investment, it is something that can be shown to have a kind of lasting impact on the estates and the lives of the people who live there.
Thank you. Mo, anything you'd like to ask? No. Thank you. Okay, on that basis then, could we please all agree the recommendations in paragraph 2, which is really approval for the overall approach and the parameters of the fund, the indicative allocation of it, and the next steps. Are we all happy to agree that? Yes, agreed? Thank you very much. I'm now going to sort of depart from the agenda slightly, because I think it's better if we take A5, A6 with A13 at the end, because they're all linked and they're interlinked questions. So if we could then move on, please, to paper, A5 and A6 go, so we come on to paper A7, which is the rental income policy, which I guess means rent collection. Kim.
Yes, thank you. And as a brief introduction, so obviously rental income is a very important part as part of our mainstream of revenue stream as far as the HRA is concerned, and servicing our funds. When we took back the housing management in 2018, there was no defined rental income and collection policy, and effectively, but we did implement a less formulaic and technical type approach in terms of collection, looking into a far more holistic way, and we feel it's now relevant for us to look at formalising the approach that we've done, and hence the paper. So our rent arrears thankfully hasn't shot up to a great extent during COVID, and I think that's a reflection and credit to the team in terms of how they've managed and collected those. So, and this policy really looks at a very preventative approach, trying to support residents when they do fall into hardship, and work with them on it. And so we'll work very closely with our housing employment team to provide, well-rounded support. And lots of conversations with residents. I think that's something else that came out of COVID, where instead of sending paper, where there was obviously no fault evictions would have been sought, we were picking to talking to the phone. So happy to take questions, and Doug's here to in fact answer some of the detail.
Thank you. Are there any questions, Josh?
Thank you, Kim. One of my questions was in 3.1. It says there was never there's no current policy on this area, and with the TMO coming in-house in 2018, just wondering why it may have taken 3 years to come up with a policy.
Doug?
So, thank you, Councillor. When we took on the functions from the TMO, there were a number of policies that were not in place, and you will recall quite a few have been here and been approved by the leadership team. This policy gap was not immediately noticed, because it's usual to have a policy that sets out the arrears framework. So things like antisocial behaviour and repairs policies were clearly ones that we needed to address first. What we had inherited was a procedure which, on the face of it, was pretty standard in terms of social housing delivery. We realised that we needed to change the emphasis and the narrative with our residents, and that started probably about a year after, so back in 2019. We carried out some consultations and local meetings with residents to talk about that, and we were ready to go out to full consultation because we had a task and finish group before that, just as the pandemic struck. So we didn't feel that going out on a policy that included eviction and some of the more punitive things at a time when lots of people were in very difficult financial hardship was a good thing. What we then did is we took the learning from the pandemic. So we made over 18,000 calls last year to our residents. We didn't evict anyone, and yet the rent arrears stayed around about the same. So that tells us that the process-orientated approach with punitive actions probably isn't the right way forward. More of a helping hand, can we get you into employment, works a lot better. We then realised, so we amended what we have, and that's what you see today. So hopefully that gives you the history and why we're here sometime after 2018 talking about it.
Thank you. I think that's a really comprehensive reply. Any other questions? No. Marie-Thérèse? No and no?
Kim, you've mentioned something about hardship. You know, most of residents in North Kensington, or some of them, they are in receipt of housing benefit and universal credit. And universal credit is very harsh system. What measures do we have to help those who fall behind in their rent, or they cannot pay?
Doug, can I ask you to respond to that?
There's quite a considerable amount of help and support. So first of all, you're quite right. Those resident or tenants that are in universal credit do, on average, owe more than if they are not. We take an allowance of that when we manage our income collection. But more importantly, in 2020, we set up a financial inclusion team which deals with individuals' overall need, if you like. So all right, you're receiving universal credit. You might be having trouble paying. We can apply for certain payments to be made direct to us. We can work with the employment team. We can work with income maximisation. We can deal with debt counselling. There's a whole array of package of support that we can bring, but also we're not on our own, and we link into other statutory services that can also come and help. So it's very much around sustaining the tenancy and making sure that people are supported, but also supported to move on to employment or ensuring that their income is maximised.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, and because we can always reply to you by email afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have a set of, do we have a figure when somebody cannot pay their rent? Because I have got a case, they have been to...
Okay, if you've got a case, we can certainly take that up afterwards. I think that's
I'll email to you.
an individual case, yes. Perhaps you could speak after, well, not after this meeting, but tomorrow or whatever. Thank you very much. Yeah, I thought it was summed up to me, and a thing on page 98, you say, non-payment of rent affects our ability to provide high-quality services, but on the other hand, we aim to sustain tenancies using eviction as a last resort, and it's that balance, isn't it? And it seems to me that this policy has achieved that balance. But I'll see, do my fellow members of the leadership team agree for the recommendations in paragraph 2? Yes? Agreed? Thank you very much. Could we now move on, please, to paper A8, which is about the SPD and canal side. Johnny, do you want a quick introduction?
Yep, thanks,
So
Elizabeth.
not a quick one, a succinct one.
I'll try. Oh, gosh, that's just one of the glass screens. So the Kensal Canalside SPD obviously relates to Kensal, which is our biggest site. It has a site allocation in the London plan and through the local plan of 3,500 homes and 2,000 jobs. And so this guidance gives expression to how that might be brought forward. I think the biggest challenge and constraint on the site is the transport piece. Some of the connectivity issues are difficult to resolve. But there are also enormous opportunities here, tackling our housing waiting list and making sure that we deliver a significant quantum of new affordable homes in the borough. That's probably enough for an introduction.
Thank you. Can I just interrupt for 1 second? Can you just take that screen down, because I know Anne has had surgery to her arm and I don't want it to fall on her. So perhaps you could breathe the other way or something, but I think it's not worth the risk of it hitting your arm. Thank you for that. Thank you for that introduction. I'm sure there are questions on this. As you can see, it's a very long paper. Jem.
Thank you, Johnny. Obviously, it is a very long document, so I'm just going to touch on one element, which is the provision of, the ambition to provide 10,000 square metres of new office space. Obviously, I imagine, given the size of the document before us, there's been an awful lot of work that has gone into it. So I'm just wondering, sort of, what projections was that based on? Was that sort of allowing for COVID, or is that sort of historic calculations given previous ways of working, perhaps?
Dan. Oh, sorry, not Dan. Apologies. Sue.
Can I pass that over to planning colleagues, please? Probably Jonathan.
Jonathan.
Okay, so it's based on employment needs survey. We undertake these monitoring exercises every so often. We need them a robust evidence base for the local plan and for policy development, which is tested and examined. And that figure sort of churned through the process, and that was the figure that came out.
I guess to Jem's point, though, was that pre-COVID?
It was pre-COVID, but it is part of the site allocation. That won't change. And clearly, I don't think we all quite know where we're going to be in terms of office demand after COVID. Our initial views are that office demand will still be required.
Thank you. Catherine, then Kim.
Thank you. Actually, slightly picking up on that point. So in 4.5, you mentioned that the impact of tall buildings, in relation to tall buildings, those over 20 stories, it was recommended that they may not be appropriate for certain housing tenants, such as social housing or family accommodation. So I just wanted to know who they would be appropriate for, and were you suggesting that they'd just be appropriate for office buildings? And if so, to Jem's point, will there be offices to fill those buildings, which we don't know? But it just seemed a bit odd that they weren't appropriate for a certain sector, and so I wanted to know who are they appropriate for?
Okay, so a piece of work was done for the Environment Select Committee to look at housing tenure and look at Kensal and how that might work in terms of building typology. And the research basically showed that tall buildings, very tall buildings, are not necessarily appropriate for all tenure types. They do work much better for market at the upper end and for couples, and perhaps not for families. So one of the challenges at Kensal will be to try and match the typologies that come forward with our housing needs. We do have to deliver on the site. We do need viability. It does need to be delivered. And so you do need a mix of different housing tenures, including market housing of the right type to be able to do that. So, I won't disguise the fact that won't be challenging. We will need to work closely with housing colleagues, but we do need to try and make sure that it's a very important point and that we will strive to make sure that we achieve that.
Thank you. And should follow up to that, on 4.5, the draft SPD was taken to the Environment Select Committee, and the two principal recommendations were made, and they have been taken into consideration, have they? Just to...
Yes, they have, so, yeah.
Thank you very much. Kim?
Yes, I just really want to ask you a question about the traffic you know, because it does worry me, this site. I always feel the northern site is a bit like a cul-de-sac, and I understand that the developers are looking to move the Sainsbury's to the gaswork end, which will mean people will have to go right the way in the site in order to Sainsbury's, to visit Sainsbury's. So my question is that beyond looking with the junctions, and also I see that there's an improved potential of using bicycles, but people aren't really going to be doing their shopping on a bicycle. I just wondered if you could elaborate. I note that you've done a modelling system which has been signed off by TfL, but I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how we're going to deal with the traffic given the significant increase of homes.
Well, the residential development itself will be largely car-free, and that's in line totally with development plan policy, including the London plan policy. So we're not envisaging that there will be a significant increase in car-generated development from the residential itself. The store will obviously, as it does at the moment, generate a certain amount of vehicular traffic. Over time, there may be other improvements so that vehicular traffic, one would like to think, wouldn't increase, and with deliveries and other things, it may well decrease. But it is a busy store. You're absolutely right, and it's absolutely essential that we do, again, through appropriate legal agreements, get the safeguards to make sure that we do get a bridge over the Paddington Main Line at the appropriate phasing within a development, and that we do get links to the west through down to Scrubs Lane, and we do get that vehicular and pedestrian bridge going across. So you're absolutely right. We do need to look at that very closely. The modelling has been done by transport engineers. I'm not a highways engineer myself, but they're satisfied with the modelling that's been done. But it is something, you're absolutely right, the site is largely landlocked at the moment, and one of the other challenges will be to make sure that we can make it as accessible as possible.
Emma.
I was just going to ask, return to the issue of tall buildings, which we know are very contentious everywhere in London. And by the way, thank you, because I know a huge amount of work went into this as well. Just kind of give us a flavour. And this, of course, is guidance. This isn't in any way binding. But, you know, what your sense is about what we might ultimately see on the site.
Yes. So,
leading question.
It is a bit. We will need tall buildings on the site. There's no doubt about that. There will be tall buildings on the site. I think that we will need to look, as the application comes in, they will need to be appraised very closely with the latest development plan policy, which is D9 within the London plan. As you've said, this is guidance. It's the policy that's really important. So quite a lot of work will need to be done with any planning application coming in to look at the impact of tall buildings on that site. We've got a Grade 1 cemetery next door, the setting of Kensal Cemetery. We understand, of course, that Kensington and Chelsea is not characterised by its tall buildings. But having said that, you know, this opportunity area does need to be optimised. There will be a different typology that comes forward here, and we will need to look very closely at the location and height of tall buildings as they come forward. We're not envisaging that we want very tall buildings, or if we do have those, they will be very, you know, kept to the absolute minimum. But there's still being further work done on that at the moment. But I can tell you that we will be appraising it very closely.
Follow up to that, what is 18 metres in stories?
That's a good question. I think it's about 6 stories.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions from the leadership team? As you say, I mean, this is incredibly important to us, this opportunity area, and 3,500 homes and 2,000 jobs is really fundamental to so many things that we're doing as a council. If there aren't any other questions, Marie-Therese, anything from your committee?
From me, thank
No.
you.
No? No. Okay. On that basis, can we please agree the recommendations in paragraph 2, which is to adopt the Kensal Canal Side Opportunity Area Supplementary Planning Document. Are we all happy with that? Agreed. Thank you. Could we now move, please, to paper A9, which is planning as well? So, Johnny.
Yep. So this obviously relates to one of the government's planning reforms. There are elements of the reforms that have been coming forward that we do support.
Oh, sorry, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Has everyone had this paper, which is the addendum? Everyone seen the addendum?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, so we have welcomed elements of the government's planning reforms over the last year or so, for example, on the local plan Pathfinder programme. But I think because of the iconic and national and international profiles of some of our centres, and Portobello Road, Sloane Street, Notting Hill Gate, some really fantastic places, and Knightsbridge, which is part of the Central Activities Zone, and also because of the differential land values between uses, and the fact that unlike other bigger places in the country, our uses and offices, for example, aren't necessarily clustered, which is something we found when we came to do an office to Resi Article 4 a few years ago. It's being recommended, and I think we ought to adopt the Article 4 direction as proposed, so that we can protect some of those fantastic world-class centres that we have in the borough, and make sure that the vitality of our neighbourhoods is not in any way affected by unforeseen consequences of the reforms.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Catherine.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say how much I really welcome this paper and how important it is that the Council is bringing forward these Article 4 directions. The paper acknowledges that there's an unsatiable demand for housing in this borough and very small amounts of space. And if the new planning developments let people just turn retail and office space into residential immediately, it would be a massive loss to our business. And I think this is really well demonstrated in point 5.3, where it goes through all the losses to the businesses and the jobs. But I think specifically it's worth noticing that we're a borough that has more than average smaller businesses, particularly in the creative businesses and the music businesses, who have office space under 15,000 square foot, who would potentially be really vulnerable to losing those spaces if we didn't put this Article 4 direction in place. So thank you, Councillor Thalasitis, for bringing this forward, and I recommend it highly to everyone.
Yes, two questions. First one, can we take a zonal view of this, or does it have to be borough-wide? That's my first question. And the second thing is that do we have any sort of data-based evidence on this in terms of valuations per square foot, so we can assess, the potential impact? Because obviously, if you've got very high value residential and low value office, I understand obviously the differential is quite high, but it might be that other things, other uses, doctor surgeries, etc., might be different. So I just wondered if that was looked at or would be available. Thank you.
To answer this, is it you, Johnny, or Jonathan? Who?
I can.
Thank you.
In terms of the zonal, yeah, we can make any choice we like, so we can recommend a zonal. I mean, it's fair to say the larger the area covered by the Article 4, the greater the chance that the Secretary of State may get involved and direct us to amend it. But it's not there's no obvious way to reduce the size of the Article 4 area, given we're really unusual in our offices. Its offices in particular are just scattered across the whole borough. I mean, there's a map in here, I forget which page, which just shows that scatter. So that's why we've gone for borough-wide rather than zonal. In terms of the figures, yeah, I think it's Appendix B, BNP did some work for us on the differential in values. They concentrated on offices and residential rather than doctor surgeries, but they're very much of the view that doctor surgeries and offices are actually, doctor surgeries are less valuable than offices, and over much of the borough, residential is worth many, many times more than commercial. What's also interesting, they're pointing out, which I think makes sense in this post-COVID world, although there's still a need for office floor space, and will be in the future, of maybe 50,000 square metres over the next few years, it's very likely over the next 4, 5, 6 years, office rental will stagnate, while they're predicting that residential will increase. So there's this impact at the moment, and if anything, it's just likely to go up over the next few years.
Are there any other, Emma?
Thank you. I think Chris will remember, because he's, that some 10 years ago, we fought very hard to save our pubs from a similar sort of threat, and created, did a motion and the work behind that. Because I'm so fantastically ignorant about planning, will you tell me what's now? Are we going to have to refight that battle all over again?
No.
Good.
So this is about... Right, at the end of last year, the government changed the planning rules in terms of use classes. So there's now some super use class, which is generally most town centre uses. So it's shops, it's restaurants, it's offices, it's gyms, it's the whole sort of thing. We think it's town centre uses. The pubs are specifically not included. So pubs are in their own use class and are not affected by this at the moment.
Well, medical centres included. Medical centres included.
Yep.
Or design?
I couldn't comment.
Thank you.
If there are no other comments from the leadership team, Mary-Therese, your committee? No, and no? No, nothing. Can I just double check that everyone is happy to make to agree with the recommendations, given as well the proposed changes to the guidance that we've had in the addendum, just to check that you're happy with that. Okay? So we agree the recommendations in paragraph 2. Agreed? Thank you very much. Right. Paper A10. Bid. Catherine.
Thank you very much. This is a very exciting paper. It's putting forward the proposal for our first bid proposal in the borough on the Brompton Road, which we're doing in partnership with Westminster Council. They're taking the lead. As we know, bids are a really effective method for businesses to work together and to actually decide how best they can invest in the things they need to support their high streets, which post-COVID is more important than ever. So the paper gives you the background, it gives you all the reasons why we think supporting this bid proposal is really important. And so I don't think there's much more than I can say, except that, that I recommend that we go forward with this.
Sorry, I was going to agree with you, Catherine. I think it's very exciting that we're getting bids off the ground now, and as we always said, it's protecting lives, protecting livelihoods, and our economy is just so key to us, and getting it back revived again. Mary?
Yes, I just wanted to comment because, of course, half of this is in my ward, and I absolutely agree that this is vital. I think even our high-end shopping streets like Stone Street are under serious threat, and without modernising and going forward and having extra resource to do that, they won't be able to have a long-term future. And I think this is really exciting. I did make the point in the consultation that for some residents, it's quite an overwhelming thought that businesses are going to be able to do this and spend extra money, and that it's very important to make sure that they don't feel left out, unconsulted, or anything like that. So I did make that, give that feedback, and I know that Catherine will carry on banging that message home as well.
Thank you. Are there any other comments, questions from the leadership team? No? Mary-Therese, anything from your committee?
Me?
No? No? Well, I think we all agree that we think this is really excellent, and we'd like to agree the recommendations in paragraph 2. Is that correct? Agreed? Thank you very much. Can we now please turn to paper A11? Mary?
Leader, thank you. This doesn't, we've looked at the financial outturn several times, so there are no real surprises here. I mean, the headline is that we had an overspend of 23 million, which is enormous as a result of mainly pandemic pressures. but that much of those pressures have been funded. We're very lucky by government grant, and we also had a large contingency ourselves. You'll see in paragraph 1.2 seems a bit counterintuitive, but much, £3.7 million of the parking reserve has been used to fund some of the deficit, because quite a lot of it was due to parking and issues around transport. So we were able to deploy that, which basically means that there was a small underspend of the contingency, essentially, which has been put into the budget stabilisation reserve. But so it could have been, if we hadn't had such good government grants, it could have been a lot worse. But we do need to bear in mind that those very pressures that we had last year are still potentially in play in ways that we can't absolutely predict at the moment.
Are there any questions or comments? As Mary said, I mean, we've looked at these figures quite a lot before, and there's nothing of great surprise here. No? Nothing from the leadership team? Mary-Therese.
So we do most of our work on the budget through the budget working group, and Mary and Taryn are very generous with their time, so we will be looking at that and arranging a meeting shortly, I hope. Okay?
Thank you. Anything? No? No? Could we then please agree the recommendations in paragraph 2? There are several of them. Yes, agreed? Agreed? Thank you. Please, could we turn now to paper A12. The Annual Treasury Management Outturn Report. Mary, you again.
Just briefly again, it almost seems as if we see this every meeting, but we see this once a year, and we see the Treasury Management strategy once a year. So we will have a new annual strategy. This is just looking back on the year and how we managed the money that we have on reserves and how we managed our borrowing. In fact, in this year, we did pay back £11.6 million of borrowing. Fundamentally, we continue to be very prudent and cautious with how we borrow and how we lend money or gain interest. We do have, as I've pointed out before, new Treasury managers who will help us to explore other options to try and get more return on our money without departing from our very cautious approach. And I don't think there's much more to say about it than that.
Just really a little bit of clarification for me. Just looking at our some of the rates on the amount of money we've been borrowing. Obviously, that some are historic debts that we're sort of paying down, but it's quite stark to note the difference between sort of 8% on a one-year loan that we must have had many years ago, compared to being able to borrow now at sort of 1.7 over 50 years. So I'm just over 10 years. So I'm just sort of wondering what our sort of forecast is to perhaps sort of refinance or look at not borrowing more than we need, but borrowing to pay off debts which are at a much higher interest rates, for instance.
With the debts at higher interest rates, there are generally penalties associated with paying them off early because we've taken them on a sort of fixed rate basis. It's just that we don't like the fixed rate anymore. But I will double check that. But I'm pretty sure we'd have paid them off we pay off anything with a higher interest rate as quickly as we can. But you know, if you weigh up the penalties, often it just isn't worth doing it.
Any questions? No? Mary-Therese, anything from your committee? No? Nothing from yours? Could we please agree that we refer this report to full council? Agreed? Thank you. Now, we go back to paper A5. So, Josh.
Sorry, I'm on air now. Thank you. So A5 is putting in place in action as part of a pilot the inclusion strategy, which we discussed in great detail in March, where we looked at the policy intent. And this paper recommends that the pilot is put in place, approving funding of £90,000 from the Grenfell Recovery Fund, and to approve the initial works that is embedding trauma training in place in 5 schools in North Kensington, and working with the voluntary sector in order to get that done.
It's a very good summary. As Josh said, we looked at this in some detail. Are there any questions on this paper? No, very good paper. If nobody seems to... Oh, yes, Mary.
Sorry, I got muddled between papers A5 and A6. This is the one where I wanted just to ask if any consideration had been given to looking at bubbles for years 7 and 8, because I have understood from various things I've read that one of the unintended positive side effects of COVID has been that keeping students in bubbles between years has insulated that very sort of sensitive transition period of years 7 and 8, when they go to big schools suddenly and are sort of around lots of people who are much older than them, and it's made them feel more secure. And I wondered if that also might be part of this inclusion strategy.
I'll pass that to Sarah. If you don't
Sarah.
mind.
Oh, what a fabulous observation. I think we'll go away and have a look at that in some more detail. I think there have been a number of unintended consequences, positive and negatives, about the bubbles. And certainly we have seen exclusion rates come down during these strange times. So absolutely take that away and have a look at it. Thank you.
Any other comments on this paper? No? Mary Trowse, anything from your committee?
Just to say that, yes, I do welcome this, and we have had a working group on school exclusions in scrutiny, and that in turn came from a group of kids in my ward, Redcliffe, and Emma and Johnny came down to meet them. So that's the kind of train of thought that I'm on. So what I'm saying is, yes, I'm very glad this is happening, but don't forget the centre and the south of the borough, because we have problems there as well.
Thank you for that. And Mo?
I have a question here. We've heard reports a few days ago that 100,000 students or pupils failed to attend or rejoin classes after COVID from now. Do we have cases like this in the borough?
Sarah,
Big numbers?
perhaps you could answer that.
Yep, so we've been monitoring attendance back at primary and secondary schools post the lockdown periods, and our attendance has generally been above that of the national average, but there have been instances of children not coming back to school for various reasons, and we have a team of social care staff in place to support those children back into school.
Thank you. If there are no other questions or comments, can I ask you to agree the recommendations in paragraph 2? Agreed? Thank you. Could we please now go on to paper A6, which is the procurement strategy of the Healthy Child Programme, which is worth a lot of money, isn't it, Josh?
Yes, thank you.
14 million or something.
That's right. So what this paper does, and what I'm myself and Councillor Kamali is recommending, is that leadership team approves the procurement strategy for our 0 to 5 Healthy Child Programme, and we're really doing this to kind of have a better integrated service, to improve our readiness, strengthening our offer, especially through children with special educational needs and disabilities, and having a program where we can intervene earlier for children, young people, where we need it. As you rightly say, Elizabeth, the contract's estimated to be up to £14 million. If, of course, this isn't the contract, this is the strategy to get to that position. But I think it's really exciting because we can really take our policy this to leaps and bounds. And what I'd like to say as well is that the Family Services Select Committee did review this. They did provide their support to the overall policy intent of this, but they did ask for updates on how the strategy is continuing in due course. So I'm very happy to provide that to them.
Thank you. Yes, I've got the reference from the Family Services Select Committee, but you said all these recommendations have been taken on board.
Yes.
Emma.
Firstly, can I say I'm absolutely delighted to see this saving. It's been a long time coming, but absolutely worth having. I just got a question on 1.5. It says our current health is encouraged a high spend commissioned local authority. Is that pre this change or post? And if it's post, are we still the highest?
Yes, sorry, Sarah, if you perhaps answer that one. I'm not sure off the top of my head, sorry.
It's pre this approach, and I'd have to check, having put this in place, where it puts us in relation to other authorities' spend.
Whoops. Any other comments, any other questions from the leadership team before I ask Mary-Therese? No? Mary-Therese, OSC?
Well, Councillor Janet Evans has given her comment.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. And no, nothing? Okay. So what we're agreeing is the implementation of this integrated delivery model across the 0 to 5 pathway and the procurement strategy for the new 5-year contract, and that the lead member for adult social care and public health and the lead member for family and children's services will approve this contract in November 2021. So can we all agree those recommendations as laid out in paragraph 2? Yes, all agreed? Thank you. And then could we please turn to the final paper this evening, which is paper A13, which I believe is Josh
Thank you.
again.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. So this paper, I'm putting forward to the leadership team to recommend the council to appoint the Ormiston Academy Trust to run our alternative provision. As people may know, the Latimer and Beechcroft alternative provision went into liquidation. So we have urgently sought a new provider to do that, and we believe Ormiston is the best option for this. We do list it in the paper, initial 12-month term for their contract, and obviously up to 3-year extension to run that provision at the Alternative Provision Academy. But very happy to take questions on that as well.
Can I suggest that we move into part B briefly before we take this decision, please? So if there's any members of the press or any members of the public, if they could excuse themselves, but I don't believe that's the case. So if we could just turn off the streaming. So are there any further questions or comments on this paper? Josh, anything else you want to add?
No, just that we're working closely with schools, secondary schools, to provide a bit more funding from their themselves in order to take their children through alternative provision.
Yeah, I should say that actually Josh and I had a meeting with 5 schools last week, and inclusion and exclusion is really right at the top of their agenda. So having these 2 papers here today show that we're helping in every way that we can, because we appreciate that they've had it's been very difficult for students over the last few years, first with Grenfell, then with COVID, and we really hope that by implementing these things that we will help schools. Mary-Therese, anything from you or your OSC? No, and no, nothing from you? Okay, on that basis, can we agree the recommendations in paragraph 2? Agreed? Thank you very much. Is there any other business tonight that I might have forgotten? No? No other business? Then I wish you all a very good evening and declare the meeting closed. Thank you very much indeed for coming.